Hey everyone, I hope you're well. I have someone very special to introduce you to today. This is Razia Daniil, and she is my second baby girl. I haven't made a YouTube video in a while. I haven't felt like I had anything to contribute to the space, but my positive birth story with my first daughter, Seneca, did really well, and a lot of people were interested in my doctor and why we moved to Cancun to have the babies. And Razia's story is a bit unique, so I thought I would tell it and hopefully encourage any mamas out there who find themselves having preterm babies. So to start, I found out I was pregnant kind of surprisingly, unlike with Seneca, which if you go back, I do have videos documenting how I found out I was pregnant, how it was super planned and everything I did to try and get pregnant. Razia was a bit different. We just stopped not trying around 9 months. Seneca was maybe 8 or 9 months, and it happened very quickly. We were about to board a red-eye flight to DC, and I just had this feeling, you know, when you just have that intuition. And so I went into the bathroom, I took a test, I looked at the test, and I was just like, yeah, I knew it. I told my husband, he was shocked and very excited. And I do have a little clip from that evening that I'll stick in here now.
We're about to leave for a red-eye flight to DC for a family trip, and something inside me just told me to take a test, and I am pregnant. I knew it.
Just because it makes for a cute memory for her to look back on. And then I took a blood test at 9 weeks. It was called Sneak Peek, and there's different kinds of blood tests you can take to find out baby's gender. This one looked at my blood for any Y chromosomes, which would indicate a boy, not baby's blood, which if you take a test, the NIPT test, which looks at baby's DNA, then it's going to be way more accurate. It told us that we were having a boy. Surprise, it was wrong. We found out we were having a girl during my 20-week anatomy scan. I only ended up doing 2 ultrasounds in Arizona. The first one was around 8 weeks, 7 or 8 weeks to hear the heartbeat and confirm the pregnancy. And so I found out at 3 weeks, and then I waited to confirm the pregnancy. And then we did our 20-week anatomy scan, and I sent all those results to my doctor here in Cancun. We moved to Cancun when I was 30, oh gosh, I don't remember. It was Easter, and I don't remember how many weeks I was, maybe 30. And I had 1 appointment with my doctor before Razia ended up coming. So let's get into that story. Around 32 weeks, so we moved when I was 30 weeks because it was about a week and a half, 2 weeks later that I started getting some cramps, and they weren't long-term. They would come and go. They felt like period cramps, so they weren't incredibly uncomfortable. I would complain about them when they kept me up at night, and I remember telling my mom, and she said, okay, if they don't go away, you need to go see Dr. Jerry. And honestly, I just thought my uterus was growing. I thought it was normal pregnancy cramps. I was walking a lot and carrying a toddler, which was different than my first pregnancy. And again, they didn't stay. They came and then they dissipated, so I wasn't too concerned. But then on May 2nd, when I was 34 weeks exactly, I was sitting on my bed and I was chatting with my mom, and I was like, oh, I think I peed myself. And I stood up and I was just bleeding everywhere. So my mom jumped up and she started cleaning up. She got me a towel, sat me down. I started talking to my doctor. I called my doctor. She was at the airport. She was in Guadalajara getting ready to get on a flight to come back to Cancun, which was really fortunate. She'd been gone all week on a family vacation. And I called my husband, who was working in the next room over, but I know how he feels about blood, so I was trying to spare him. But of course, he ran in all worried, and when he saw the blood, he turned completely green. He had to go lay down for a second, which was fine because I was waiting to hear from my doctor about what we should do next. So my doctor got in touch with a colleague of hers who works at the hospital. He was actually a teacher of hers, and set us up with an immediate appointment. Oh, breastfeeding pause. Hold on. Okay, so when we left off, I was getting an appointment with a colleague of my doctor's. So I went to the hospital with absolutely nothing. I was in my baggy t-shirt and some flip-flops. My husband brought our passports, and the hospital's only a block away, so I'd been walking to and from for the ultrasound and some lab tests, etc. But luckily the landlord of where we're staying was on the property that day, and she was so sweet. She drove us to the hospital and dropped us off. So I went to this appointment with this OBGYN, and he kind of explained what we were looking for. So my cervix had to be longer than 3 centimeters, 3 millimeters, had to be longer than 3 something. And we didn't want to be dilated at all. And we wanted to, of course, check that baby was okay. So we were going to do an ultrasound, check her heartbeat, her blood supply, all those things. So the first thing we did was look at baby, and her heartbeat was strong and regular, no brady or tachycardia, so she wasn't in distress, and she was head down, ready to be born. And when he checked me, I was about 1 centimeter dilated, and my cervix was very short, like 2 something, so I was in labor. I was starting labor. Now we needed a game plan. He checked me into the emergency room of Hospital Galenia, where I gave birth to Seneca, where my doctors are located here in Cancun. And we started on a drug that lowers blood pressure, hoping that it would reduce the uterine contractions and slow labor while we figured out what was causing it, so that we could attack that and hopefully stop labor completely. So this drug seemed to be working. My contractions were lessening. I was hooked up to the monitor so that they could actually monitor my contractions, and they could hear baby's heartbeat and confirm that her oxygen supply was good and that she was totally fine. And then they also gave me a shot, which was like a surfactant, and that was supposed to help her lungs open up so that if she was going to be born, she had a better chance of having working lungs. We had one shot of that. It was around 5 p.m. on May 2nd, and we were hoping that I wouldn't have the baby. And then in 24 hours, at 5 p.m. on May 3rd, I'd have a second shot of that surfactant. And then 72 hours after the second shot, it would have the full-blown effects, and she could be born with full confidence that her lungs would be strong enough to support her. So we were really hoping to hold out. This was on a Thursday. We were hoping to hold out until Monday evening, at most, for her birth. But the drug didn't end up working, and around 10 p.m., my husband had just left me at the hospital. I started bleeding again. So they called the doctor back in, and he told me that the drug wasn't working and I was bleeding again because labor was progressing. And this was the first time during the whole day that I started feeling a little emotional. Previously, I was calm, even when I was bleeding, when I was getting all the drugs. I was also on antibiotics in case it was a bacteria that was causing my uterus to contract. I was very calm, mostly because I felt fine. I didn't feel like I needed to vomit or faint. I wasn't in pain other than these really baby contractions. So I was pretty confident that baby and I were okay. But once he confirmed that I was going into labor, I started getting a little emotional just because it was so unexpected and she was so early. But right in that moment, Dr. Jerry Lee walked in from the airport, and I was about to break down, it just dissipated. I felt so much better. And she dismissed her colleague, and her and I stayed up all night trying a different drug. The second drug that she gave me was in my IV. Previously, it was an oral drug. And this one acted directly on my uterus to freeze it from contracting. And we stayed up all night together counting contractions. She rubbed me down with lavender oil. We listened to meditations. She's more like a friend who knows how to deliver babies. I mean, she's just such a gift, honestly. And there are many perks to giving birth in Cancun, but the real reason that makes moving out here and having my babies here totally worth it is that when something doesn't go according to my birth plan, it's Dr. Jerry Lee Martinez that I want at my side, 100%. And she stayed with me the entire night in her, hi baby, in her travel clothes. And we counted contractions. The drug seemed to be working. We went from having one every 3 minutes. Got some gas? I went from having a contraction every 3 minutes to every 8 minutes, and they were lasting about a minute long, but we were cheering every time one came, and we had a longer break each time. So it was like 3 minutes, then 4, then 6, then 8, and we were so excited because this drug was working. My blood test came back and I didn't have an infection, so we still weren't sure what was causing me to go into labor, but we were continuously checking baby's heartbeat and everything was fine. We did go up to her office and get another ultrasound some point during the night, and I was about 2 centimeters dilated now. Baby was head down. She was still looking good. The blood supply to her umbilical cord and her brain were great. She had bladder. She had urine in her bladder, which means that she was processing amniotic fluid just fine. Like, everything with baby was great, and I felt fine too. I was still bleeding, but it was minimal compared to what it had been. So we were excited about this second drug. Then she took me back down to my hospital room, and the contractions started getting very intense. It was like in the movies where, you're like moaning through them, and she was supporting me through all of them. And we were counting them, and they went from 8 minutes to 6 to 4 and back down to 3. She checked me again, and I was 5 centimeters dilated. And that's when she said, "You're too dilated for us to stop labor," because even if we could, the chance of infection with such an open cervix is really high, and it's not safe for me or baby. So we're going to scrap the drugs, and you're giving birth. And this was maybe 3 a.m. and it kind of hit me that, okay, I really am having a preterm baby. And that's when I just started throwing questions at her because I was so curious about what that would look like. I hadn't really thought about it until that moment. I was, asking about the NICU at the hospital, and she said it was very good. The NICU, the nursery, all very good, but I wasn't going to need it. That my baby's lungs were going to be strong enough. We know her blood supply is good. We know that her heartbeat is strong. I'm not going to need it. I'm going to birth my baby like normal. She's just going to be preterm. So that gave me a lot of confidence. I still had some irrational fears about how tiny she was going to be. I thought maybe she'd be like a teacup or have translucent skin or something. These are just the things that run through your mind when you've never had or known someone who was preterm. And so I was asking her all these kind of silly questions, but she was so sweet and so confident that everything was going to be fine, that I was going to be fine, that I was then confident. So because I was 5 centimeters, I was able to get my epidural. We called the same anesthesiologist as in my first video with Seneca, Felix. He's an angel. He got to the hospital within 30 minutes of calling him. And because I'd already had my IV, I was already 5 centimeters, I was able to get the epidural right away, which was fantastic. With Seneca, I did have to wait. I entered the hospital at 4 centimeters, which is the minimum for an epidural. And then they had to hook me up to the IV and all that stuff, and check me into the emergency room. This time I was already administered. So that took about 45 minutes with Seneca. And by the time that I was getting the medication, I was already 9 centimeters and feeling the full-blown contractions of 9 centimeters. So I was very grateful this time around that I was able to get my epidural at 5 centimeters, and I was numb and happy. I mean, if you've had an epidural, maybe you can still feel the contractions, but they're manageable, and it actually helps to feel them when you're pushing and giving birth. So I got my epidural before I even called my mom and my husband. And I did call them around 4 a.m. and I told them the drugs didn't work. We're having this baby. And to be fair, they had gone home around, my husband went home around 9:30, and they all were asleep. My mom was at home with Seneca, our toddler, taking care of her. So she wasn't at the hospital at all that day. They had barely any idea of what had been going on all night, that I had been having these contractions, that they got more intense. So I was sort of getting prepared for having the baby. They just woke up in the middle of the night, early morning, and were told to pack bags because this baby was coming. And with how fast my labors are and how dilated I was, Jerry Lee was very confident that the baby would come before sunrise. So they did not have a lot of time to get what we needed for a 2-day stay in the hospital. But my husband packed his little backpack and ran over to the hospital, and my mom stayed and got all the stuff for me and Seneca, and she took a little bit more time for us just so that Udias could be with me during this time. So once the epidural was administered and my family was there, everything kind of went the same as with Seneca, which I'm grateful for, which was exactly to my birth plan. It's everything I wanted. Except we didn't have someone to watch Seneca while Udius and my mom were with me in the delivery room. And I did want both of them there as I had with Seneca. First of all, I want my husband there to support me. And then my mom is a fantastic doula type personality. And so she's very helpful to have in the delivery room. And so Dr. Jerily called her mom and asked her mom to come to the hospital that morning and watch Seneca for us. And she did. Her mom showed up. She was an angel of a human, and her and Seneca got along right away. They went down to the garden, and she played with Seneca in the hospital while we went up to the delivery room, and I gave birth to Razia. My birth plan with Rezi was the same as I wanted with Seneca. So I wanted a vaginal birth, no episiotomy, an epidural. I wanted skin to skin immediately for as long as possible. I wanted delayed cord clamping for as long as possible. I wanted my husband and my mom in the room. I wanted to be able to eat whatever I wanted when I wanted, but I never labor that long. And that's exactly how this birth went. Honestly, as soon as we were in the delivery room, the fact that she was a preemie didn't make much of a difference. Other than the pediatrician that we had with us was a neonatal specialist. So I pushed a few times like I did with Seneca. It felt very fast. It felt very, easy as far as giving birth goes. The epidural, again, made the pain manageable. I could still feel the contractions which helped with pushing, but there was still discomfort. I mean, you're giving birth. So I'm very grateful for how everything went, and it went according to plan. Apart from when I was birthing the placenta, we got 5 minutes of getting blood from the placenta into Rezi before we cut the cord. But the placenta, when I was birthing it, Dr. Jerily said that she saw signs that it had been coming off of my uterine wall, which perhaps is where the bleeding was coming from, which is why my body was evicting Razia in order to save her so that she didn't suffocate if the placenta did fully detach. So that is the working theory about why I went into labor so early. But as far as the labor itself, the delivery, it all went so perfectly. She came out, they put her on my chest right away for some skin to skin. She cried. She's a very quiet baby. She doesn't cry very often, and that was the same for that day. She did cry to show her lungs were working, but she's not a very loud baby. So after some time, they took her for her, I forget what it's called, the test where they score them, and she did great. They checked her O2 levels. They were 100%, which were higher than mine. She was just a healthy baby who happened to come out earlier. She was very tiny. She still is. She's quite skinny. Of course, she's a preterm. So Razia Daniil was born at 8:40 a.m. on May 3rd, 2024. She was 47 centimeters and 2.146 kgs, something like that. I stayed in the hospital for one more night. My dad flew in. He was working in Poland. He flew in the next day to meet Rezi and spend 3 days off that he had with us. So that was very special, very helpful. Glennie is a beautiful hospital. I really enjoy spending my time there. The food is great. So honestly, everything was dandy. We left after that second night and walked home, put the girls in their strollers and walked home. And we've been great ever since. She had her 1 week checkup, which was very important. We were assured that all babies lose weight after birth, but she couldn't lose more than 10% of her body weight. When they weighed her that day, she hadn't lost anything, so I was very proud. We didn't have to do any kind of feeding intervention. Exclusively breastfeeding is working for her. And the only difference is we keep her out of the AC because she's prone to getting cold with not a lot of fat on her body. And I would say breastfeeding this time is a lot easier. I don't know if it's because she's a preterm, maybe she doesn't suck as hard, and I don't know, maybe my body, because I've tried this before. I do have a whole video on my breastfeeding journey with Seneca and how I didn't enjoy it and I didn't do it for more than 3 months. But this time I'm actually enjoying it. It's coming quite naturally this time. It's not painful. She's getting enough. So I'm quite proud of our breastfeeding journey this time around. I'm recovering well. I have pretty much the same symptoms as I did with Seneca, except with Senny, I had minimal tearing. With her, I had zero because she was so small, she just slipped right out. So that's been nice. Bleeding is normal. It's day 12. She's 12 days old today and still bleeding very lightly now. I think we're on the tail end of that. I did have hemorrhoids. If you had hemorrhoids post-birth, you'll know how awful that is. That lasted maybe 4 or 5 days. Thankfully, they're calm now and I seem to be in the clear. I can't think of anything else in terms of recovery. I'm pretty much there now. I'm recovered. I'm feeling good. I'm excited to be a mom of 2 girls. So I do want to encourage mamas, if you see this video and then you find yourself in a preterm situation, I know that it's so different week to week. 32 weeks is going to be very different to 34. Like I said, we were 34 in 1 day, so we barely made that late preterm cutoff, but it doesn't have to be scary. I encourage you to stay calm and strong for you and your baby. You're going to be fine. Since having Razia, I've actually met quite a few women, the nurse who was taking care of me, my Spanish teacher, and the landlord, who all know someone who was born at 34 weeks, had their baby at 34 weeks, or was themselves born at 34 weeks, and they were all healthy babies and with nothing wrong. So that was very encouraging, and it's always funny how that ends up happening. I think I went more into depth about why we give birth in Cancun, all the benefits of it, in Seneca's birth story, but if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask. I'm a totally open book. You can ask me anything. But other than that, we're just so grateful to have these 6 extra weeks with Razia. Razia is a uniquely Latvian name, which is where my husband is from, and we call her Rezi for short and for more of an Americanized version of her name. And then Danielle, her middle name, is after my mother. That's it. I'm gonna stop.